Hey guys, welcome back to Econ class. Today we're going to be looking at taxes, tax revenue, and the deadweight loss caused from taxes. So our objectives for today: identify and calculate the cost and benefits of taxation, define tax incidence, and identify the division of the tax burden, illustrate the impact of taxation on consumer, producer, and total surplus, and then identify and calculate the deadweight loss from taxation, and then finally assess the impact of elasticity on tax incidence, revenues, and deadweight loss. Now, before we start applying taxation to economic models, let's talk a little bit about why we have taxes in the first place. Now, there's two main reasons that the government implements taxes on us. So it's to raise revenue for the public projects, whether that is a redistribution of wealth, whether it's to build highways, whether it is to build schools, however we want to, put that money to use. That's why they have taxes, one reason. The other one is to manipulate market outcomes. Now, when we get into externalities, we'll investigate this a little further, but just understand that they can manipulate the size of a market using different taxes and subsidies. So we have two different types of taxes that we're going to be looking at in this unit. Well, two different categories. A per unit tax, which is each item is going to be taxed at this particular rate, and this will shift the supply, or in some cases the demand curve, or it'll shift the marginal cost curve as we see in Unit 3. And then there are lump sum taxes. These will not shift the marginal cost curve. This will shift the average total cost curves, and it doesn't impact the market size in the short run. It's only going to impact profit, loss, different points of shutdown in the short run. So in this particular video, in this particular unit, we are looking at per unit taxes, not lump sum taxes. Lump sum taxes will come into play in Unit 3. Now, the government can require that either the buyer or the seller submit the actual tax payment. But as we go through these slides, you're going to understand that who the government decides is actually going to pay it really doesn't impact the market as much as the elasticity of the curves. But let's run through some examples first. So a tax on suppliers, the supplier is physically going to submit the payment. The seller is going to submit the payment to the government. So this is going to shift the supply curve. It's going to shift it up or to the left. We are going to be supplying less at every price level. So we're going to label this curve S plus tax. Now, because of this curve shift, we have a new equilibrium. The distance between these two curves, the vertical distance between these two curves, indicates the size of the tax. So our new equilibrium here gives us a new price in the market. This is the price that the buyers are going to pay, the PB. And the quantity, the new quantity in the market, this is a quantity with the tax. So there's government interference. It's manipulating the market. So this is the price that the buyer paid. We also have the price that the seller is going to receive. All right, so the buyer comes in, he pays this amount of money. The seller is going to get that amount of money, but he also has to send that tax in. So the distance between the price that the buyer pays and the price that the seller receives after the tax is the size of the tax, the distance between those two curves. So PB minus PS gives us the size of the tax in this particular model. Now, because the buyers are paying a higher price, consumer surplus is going to shrink. The price is higher, so the distance between the demand curve and the price is going to be smaller than what it was before. And the same thing is going to happen with producer surplus. The seller is receiving less than he received before, and so his producer surplus is going to shrink as well. Now, that area between the producer and consumer surplus represents our tax revenue. We are still selling Q plus T units in this particular market, and the distance between PB and PS is the amount of the tax. So the area, the yellow area right here, the tax revenue, is represented by the per unit tax times the amount sold in the market. Now, we also have our deadweight loss. Now, this area represents the lost surplus in this market. Now, alternatively, you can see a tax on the consumer, the buyer, where the buyer physically has to submit the payment to the government. Now, in this case, we'll see the demand curve shift to the left or downward because we're going to be buying less at every price level because price is going to be higher with that tax. So the distance between the two curves, once again, is the amount of the tax per unit. We have a new equilibrium that gives us the price that the seller is going to receive. Here's our new equilibrium. PS is what the seller receives, and the price that the buyer pays in the market, when you go to the store, it's going to be at PS, but the buyer has to submit that extra tax payment. So the distance between PS and PB represents that extra tax, that extra payment the buyer has to submit into the government, giving us a new price that the buyer has to pay. Now, this new price causes a smaller consumer surplus. Just like the lower price that the seller receives is going to cause producer surplus to go down. We are then going to have a tax revenue as usual, and also a deadweight loss. So this goes to show it doesn't matter who's paying the tax, the buyer or the seller. There is going to be tax revenue, there is going to be a loss of producer and consumer surplus, and there is going to be deadweight loss to the market, the loss to that total surplus in the market. All right. Now, tax incident is basically explaining who is going to pay the tax. There are different types of taxes that you might come across. An excise tax, that's on producers, and it shifts the supply curve. Sales taxes can be on the buyer, they can be on the seller, and they'll usually specify it in the question, but honestly, it really doesn't matter who's paying the tax, who is physically submitting the tax. Your model can be manipulated in a couple different ways, and the outcome is going to be the same regardless of who is actually going to pay the tax. So if it doesn't physically specify who is going to pay it, stick with the supply curve. It makes your answers much easier. It makes your models more consistent. So just stick with shifting the supply curve. So in this one, we're going to look at two different examples on top of one another and see how the exact same tax from the buyer or the seller's point of view, whether the buyer or the seller is submitting the payment, ends up with the exact same result. So tax incident, like I said, it's the division of the tax burden. Who actually bears the burden of the tax? So in this case, we're going to put a $2 tax on consumers. So that demand curve shifts down by $2. This means in this particular example, the seller is going to receive $4. The buyer has to pay that $4 in the market plus the $2 extra to the government, meaning the buyer is going to pay $6. The price was $5 per unit. After the tax, the buyers pay $6, the sellers get $4. So the tax incidence is $1 a piece. The buyers are going to pay $7 on those 7 units sold. The sellers are going to pay $7 on those 7 units sold. So they're equally splitting the tax burden. Even though the buyer has to submit the payment because of the market change, it results in a burden half paid by the buyer, half paid by the seller. Now, let's do the same thing, but with the seller actually physically submitting the tax. So we see our supply curve shift left or up by the $2 tax. We see that the buyer is now paying $6 per unit, and the seller is going to receive $4 after he pays that tax. He's going to get the $6 from the buyer, but then he has to give $2 to the government, so he ends up with only $4 left. So we have the sellers still getting $4, we have the buyers still paying $6. Nothing has changed in this market, even though it's a supply curve we shifted instead of the demand curve. So once again, each are going to pay the $1 of the $2 tax. A total $7 paid by the buyer, $7 paid by the seller because we've sold 7 units in this particular market. So the tax incidence is split perfectly between the buyer and the seller in this particular example. So let's talk about how elasticity impacts the taxation of a given market. Now, like I said, the government can control who physically submits the payment, who has to fill out the check, who has to send it into the government. The government can control that. But who really receives the burden of the tax is going to be based on elasticity. So elasticity dictates who really bears the burden. A relatively inelastic curve is going to pay the burden of the tax. So whoever is less responsive to a price change is going to have the heavier burden of a given tax, regardless if it's the consumer that has to physically submit it or the seller that has to physically submit it. And also, whoever has the relatively inelastic curve is going to lose a larger portion of their surplus. Now, let's look at this market. We have a relatively inelastic supply curve, or inversely, a relatively elastic demand curve. All right, we're going to put a $2 tax on consumers. This shifts the demand curve down by $2. That means that the seller is going to receive $3.50 in this market, and the buyer is going to end up paying that $5.50 after he sends in the payment. That new demand curve gives us a new equilibrium price, and that means that the seller gets $3.50, the buyer has to send in that extra $2, which means he's going to pay $5.50 out of pocket. All right, so the price was $5, the buyers are paying $5.50, the sellers get $3.50. Consumer surplus is going to shrink for the buyers, producer surplus is going to shrink for the sellers. We have a tax revenue of $14 here, 7 units sold at $2 per unit. Deadweight loss is going to be 3. So the buyers are going to pay 50 cents out of each unit of tax. The sellers are going to spend $1.50 on the tax out of each unit. The supply curve is relatively inelastic compared to the demand curve, so the seller pays the higher burden of the tax. The more relatively inelastic that curve is, the larger the percentage of the tax that they're going to actually have to pay. Remember, elasticity dictates who has the burden of the tax, not the government. The government can specify who physically submits it, but not who actually pays it in the market. Now, let's look at this example one more time, but this is where the seller sends in the tax. So in this particular one, it's a $2 tax on producers, so the supply curve shifts up. The buyer is now going to pay $5.50. Consumer surplus shifts, is reduced. The seller is going to receive $3.50 per item because he has to pay in $2 of that $5.50 he receives, being left $3.50 afterwards. So we're at the same situation here. The seller is going to end up with $3.50. The buyer is going to end up paying $5.50 for this particular unit. Now, once again, the incidence of the tax is the same. 50 cents is paid by the buyers, $1.50 is paid by the sellers. So, like I said, it doesn't matter who submits the payment. Elasticity of the particular curves is what dictates who has the heavier burden of the tax. So let's look at elasticity's impact a little bit more. So remember, the relatively inelastic curve is going to have the heavier burden of the tax when it's implemented. And it's also going to lose a larger portion of their surplus. So if there's a relatively inelastic demand curve, like on the model to the right, they're going to lose more consumer surplus than producer surplus is lost, and they're going to pay a higher portion of the tax. And the relatively inelastic supply curve is going to lose a larger portion of their producer surplus and pay a larger portion of the tax. So on the model on the left, supply is going to receive the heavier burden of the tax. On the model on the right, demand is going to receive the heavier burden of the tax. So let's put the same tax on both models. And we're just simply going to shift the supply curve because it's easier. Each of these curves is shifted by the same amount. It just looks different because the elasticities are different. So when we do this, we're going to get a different set of prices that the buyer pays, prices that the seller receives. And the tax on each of these particular markets stays exactly the same. It's just who is paying them. The higher burden of the tax that's going to change. So we have on the left a relatively inelastic supply curve. And we can see from this that the seller portion of the taxes is much greater than the buyer portion of the taxes. This tax is exactly the same. Model on the right, relatively inelastic demand curve. Now remember, curve that's more inelastic, relatively more elastic, is going to pay the higher burden of the tax. And that's exactly what we see here. The buyer is going to pay the higher portion of the taxes. So the more elastic the market, just in general, the more deadweight loss that we're going to see in the market. All right. And actually it's less taxes are going to be paid in because more of the market is going to be lost when it's more elastic. So let's look at the difference in impact to a given market based on the relative elasticity of the entire market. So market on the left has a relatively inelastic market. The curves are more inelastic than they are on the right. So if we implement the same tax on both, we can see that the tax revenues are going to be different. The deadweight loss is going to be different. The more elastic a market is, the larger the deadweight loss. The more inelastic a market is, the less deadweight loss there is. Because in inelastic markets, it doesn't change much when price changes. So given the same tax change, there's going to be less loss to the market in an inelastic market than there is in an elastic market. All right, so I'm going to quickly introduce a second model in this particular video. This one is called the Laffer Curve. And this one does show up on the AP exam from time to time, but it's usually just a reference to it or just explaining what this model actually illustrates. So it's a model that illustrates the relationship between the size of the tax and the actual tax revenue that we receive. So tax revenues initially increase. So if we throw a tax on the market, we increase the tax a little bit, tax revenues are going to increase as well. But as we kind of cross a threshold to where consumers are responding more drastically to this tax, we lose more consumers. So we might increase the tax a little too much and tax revenues start to drop back down. And eventually, if we tax too much, it cleans out the entire market and there is nobody buying the product anymore. So this is why governments typically want to tax inelastic goods or goods that are causing problems in the market that they really want to reduce the use of, because inelastic goods people respond less to. And the increase in tax revenues can last a lot longer. And elastic demand, people respond heavily to the price changes, so they're going to lose tax revenues a lot quicker. So let's look at this in terms of applying different size taxes to this given market. Now we've chosen a very general, relatively unit elastic model to kind of demonstrate this. But let's say we throw a given tax. So the larger the tax on a particular market, the greater the deadweight loss is going to be. That's going to stay true. The larger the loss of quantity in the market, that's going to stay true as well. But it doesn't always guarantee that larger tax revenue like we saw on the Laffer Curve. So let's increase the size of this tax to a little bit higher. And the medium tax that we've just applied is giving us a lot more tax revenue. Maybe not a lot more, but more tax revenue than we had with the small tax. But when we jump up that next step, our size of our tax revenue decreases again. All right, so we may get gains in tax revenue through the government's point of view, but eventually too much of a tax is going to cause the market to decrease even more, and the tax revenues start to decrease as well. So the government takes this into mind when applying taxes. How much can the market withstand? How much do we want to manipulate the size of this given market? All right, so a couple things to keep in mind. If the tax doubles, deadweight loss is going to quadruple. So the increase in deadweight loss is always the square of the factor increase of the tax. Just keep that in mind, general rule, because there's usually a question that pops up about if the tax doubles, what happens to deadweight loss? And it's an easy answer. Tax doubles, deadweight loss is going to increase by the square of that. All right, so the last thing I want to go over before we're done here is what is actually identified as total surplus when we're looking at taxation. So consumer surplus is definitely part of total surplus. Producer surplus is going to be added into the total surplus. Now the tricky part here is that tax revenue is as well. We're not looking at tax revenue as a total loss because the government's getting something. They can, redistribute that wealth. They can use it for public projects, whatever they want to do. So it is part of total surplus. It's not a complete loss to the market. Even though it's consumers and producers that are getting hit, the government has it. The only part that is not part of total surplus is the deadweight loss. All right, so when you're calculating total surplus, if a question specifically asks for what is the change in total surplus or what is total surplus after the tax, you have to add in the tax revenue in addition to consumer and producer surplus. All right, guys, hopefully you were able to follow along with that. If not, rewind it, try it again. And also make sure you're checking out the practice worksheet that I've given you guys. It's in the description below. It goes over a few specific models, things like perfectly inelastic supply and demand or perfectly elastic, and it looks at how those models would play out. And be sure to check out the follow-up video going over that particular worksheet. All right, also check out the next video in this Unit 2 series. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.